Hello friends and welcome to another online video of Ms. Hoskins' AP Environmental Science. This section is on population and community ecology. Even without human activity, natural communities do not stay the same forever. Change in the species composition of communities over time is a perpetual process in nature. In this next unit, we will look at how both terrestrial and aquatic communities change over time. Community succession. You should be able to, by the end of this lesson, be able to explain the process of primary succession, secondary succession, and aquatic succession. AP tests love to talk about aquatic succession. So be able to describe the factors that determine the species richness of a community that is under succession. Primary succession starts with no soil. Virtually every community experiences ecological succession in some fashion, which is predictable by the replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. Depending on the type of community, ecological succession can occur over time. It can vary from decades to even centuries of time. It really just depends. Some terrestrial communities, they begin with bare rock and no soil. Other communities can be left from exposed rock that could have been left behind from a glacial retreat, or even if when after a volcanic eruption occurs, newly cooled lava, and all the way into like an abandoned parking lot when things start to grow back through the technically rock layer of the asphalt. So when this succession begins with bare rock and no soil, we call that primary succession. This figure shows the process of primary succession in a temperate forest, like for New England, for example. The bare rock can be colonized by organisms like algae, lichens, or moss, and these organisms can survive with little to no soil at all. As these early successional species grow, they excrete acids that allow them to take up nutrients directly from the actual rock. And the resulting chemical alteration of the rock also makes it more susceptible to erosion. So when the algae and the lichens and the moss, when they die, they become dead organic matter. And that mixes with the minerals eroded from the rock, and it starts to create a soil. So over a long period of time, soil develops into this bare surface and becomes a hospitable environment for plants with a deep root system. Mid-successional plants, such as areas of like wildflowers and grasses, they move into these spots. And these species are typically well adapted to exploit like open, sunny areas and are able to survive in this young, nutrient-poor soil. The lives and deaths of these mid-successional species gradually improve the quality of soil within that area and increasing the ability to retain nutrients in the water, nutrients and water in the soil. As a result, these new species colonize the area and outcompete their mid-successional species. The type of community that eventually develops is determined by the temperature there, the rainfall, and the region. So like in the United States, succession primarily creates a forest or a grassland out in the Midwest or a shrubland in the Southwest. In some areas, the number of species increases as succession proceeds. In others, late successional communities have fewer species than early successional communities. Secondary succession occurs in areas that have been disturbed but have not completely lost soil. Like there's been no volcanic eruption. Secondary succession follows an event like a forest fire or a hurricane, something that removes a lot of the vegetation, but it actually leaves the soil pretty much intact. And so that area starts with a seed bank. Secondary succession also occurs on abandoned agricultural fields, like we talked about, like the New England forest at the very beginning of this section. So this figure shows the process of secondary succession, again, for a typical U.S. forest. It usually begins with rapid colonization of plants that can easily disperse in the distributed area. The first to arrive are typically plants like grasses and wildflowers, and they have a high light tolerance. They're also pretty tolerant to wind disturbances. Um, and the first to grow there are not always in the seed bank. They can also have wind blown or bird fed seeds. As the primary succession of these species eventually are replaced by better competitors, we start to see more different types of plants grow more rapidly, and the soil becomes of better quality. Usually, like the seeds of an aspen tree, for example, can be carried by the wind, and a cherry tree seeds, those can also be carried by birds. Um, that that when they consume the fruit, and as they're flying, it falls to the ground. But trees like the aspen or the cherry, that are often the first larger organisms to colonize, are what we call a pioneer species. We call them this because their ability to colonize a new area very rapidly and grow very well in like full sunshine environments makes them a pioneer. As these pioneer trees increase in number and they grow larger, however, they cause an increased amount of shade on the ground below. And because these pioneer trees need full sunshine to grow, new seedlings of these trees at the bottom, they cannot live. So, in contrast, species that are more shade tolerant, like birch and maple, they can survive better where there's less sunlight. Then they start to take hold and uproot and grow. And they can survive pretty well in the midst of the shade of these pioneer tree species. These shade tolerant species grow up through the center of the canopy and eventually can outcompete the pioneer trees to become the dominant part of the forest. And that's why we see a lot of very tall beech and maple, like broadleaf tree forest in the United States. Succession occurs in a variety of systems, and it does occur in aquatic ecosystems. Historic, Historically, ecologists have described succession as ending in what we call a climax stage. In forests, for example, ecologists considered the oldest forest to be the climax forest. However, it is now recognized that because natural disturbances like fire, wind, and outbreaks of insects and herbivores are a regular part of nature and communities, a late successional stage is typically not final because at any moment it can be reset to an earlier stage. Disturbances also create opportunities for succession in aquatic environments. So, for example, like the rocky intertidal zone of the Pacific coast of North America is exposed to the air during low tide and lies underwater during high tide. So, from time to time, major storms turn over these rocks and they clear out the surfaces of all the living things that are on these rocks. And these bare rocks can be colonized through a process of primary succession. Diatoms, which we've discussed before, and short-lived species of red and green algae are usually the first to arrive. Not long after that, the rocks are colonized by barnacles, and then several species of other algae and things quickly develop. And in about 15 months or so, you can finally see larger organisms there. Within about 3 years or more, you can start to see like dominated species of like barnacles and mussels, and eventually starfish and things arrive. So in this figure, you can see the pattern of succession in a freshwater lake. A glacier may have come and carved out a lake basin, scouring of sediments and vegetation. And then over time, algae and aquatic plants colonize the lake. The growth of plants and the erosion of the surrounding rock and the slowly filling of this basin with sediments and organic matter make it increasingly more and more and more shallow. And so this process, which may take hundreds or even thousands of years, will eventually fill the lake up completely and make it terrestrial and make it a prairie. The species richness of a community is influenced by many factors, and the relative importance of these processes varies from region to region, and it's influenced by latitude, time, habit size, and distance from other communities. As we move from the equator towards north or the South Pole, the number of species starts to decline. So, for example, the southern latitudes of the United States support about 12,000 species of plants, whereas the similar sized area in northern Canada supports only about 1,700 species. This latitudinal pattern is also observed among birds, reptiles, amphibians, and insects. So, for more than a century, scientists have sought to understand the reasons for this pattern, yet those reasons still remain unclear. Patterns of species richness are also regulated by time. The longer the habitat has existed, the more colonization, speciation, and extinction can occur in that habitat. So, for example, Lake Baikal, which is the world's oldest lake, and it's in Siberia. It's more than 25 million years old. It's one of the oldest lakes in the world. Its benthic zone is home to over 580 different species of invertebrates. So by contrast, only 4 species of invertebrates inhabit the benthic zone of the Great Slave Lake of northern Canada. This lake that is similar to in size, it's similar in size and latitude even to Lake Baikal, but it's only a few of tens of thousands of years old. And so this difference between the two suggests that the older communities have more opportunities for speciation. The final 2 factors that influence species richness are size of the habitat and the distance of the habitat from the source of a colonizing species. These factors are all based on what we call the theory of island biogeography, which demonstrates the dual importance of habitat size and distance from the mainland to determine how rich in species the area actually is. Essentially, larger habitats typically contain more species, and the distance between habitats and a source of its colonization is also another factor. The easiest way for me to describe this is to explain it like oceanic islands that are of a greater distance from the continent definitely have fewer species than the islands that are closer to the continent. So distance away from the original area that was colonized definitely makes a difference in how the species are diverse there. We see lots of examples of this in nature. Species richness increases as the size of the habitat increases. And in this diagram right here, this example, researchers counted the number of bird species that inhabited the Reed Islands in Lake Valence, which is in Hungary. In this island area, as the island size or the island square mileage, as that increased, the number of bird species initially rose really, really quickly, but then it began to slow because it had to do with the distance from the actual mainland of Hungary. The effects of colonization, speciation, and extinction on species richness of communities have important implications for conservation. The theory of island biogeography was originally applied to oceanic islands, but it's since been applied to all kinds of habitat islands within continents, or anything that we can determine is technically an island. So if you've ever been hiking on Kennesaw Battlefield Mountain, you'll notice that large rocks pop up through the ground there. And with all of these rocks, based on the size of rocks, there are 3 different species of lichens that can grow on these rocks. And as you hike through the mountain, you'll notice that larger rocks will contain quite a bit more variety of lichen that live on them as opposed to these smaller rocks. So if we set aside any type of natural habitat for any sort of given species, we need to consider both the size of the protected area and, of course, the distance from the original colonization area the landscape is.